In 1980, Michael Cimino's film Heaven's Gate failed so spectacularly that its title became synonymous with disaster for years. When Kevin Costner's WATERWORLD came out in 1995, the press mockingly dubbed it Kevin's Gate, predicting a box office failure. Many believe Heaven's Gate marked the turning point when Hollywood studios began closely monitoring directors and retaining full creative control. So, every time filmmakers complain about studio interference today, they should blame it all on Heaven's Gate and Michael Cimino himself. Initially, Heaven's Gate seemed like a guaranteed success for United Artists. They had Michael Cimino, whose previous film The Deer Hunter was a massive box office hit and won 5 Academy Awards. At the 1979 ceremony, Cimino won the Oscar for Best Director. The studio was ready to fund any idea he had, and he didn't take long to find one. In 1979, the studio gave Cimino $12 million for a film based on true events that took place in Wyoming in 1890. These events later became known as the Johnson County War. The film centered on the conflict between immigrants and wealthy American cattle barons. Trying to make a living on American soil, immigrants began stealing livestock from the Stock Growers Association. For some reason, the association didn't appreciate this behavior and recruited men to shoot at local farmers and terrorize them. Naturally, the mercenaries didn't bother figuring out who was right or wrong. As a result, innocent people quickly started falling victim. After the lynching of Jim and Ella Averill, small farmers, realizing the American justice system was unable to protect them, armed themselves with pitchforks. 6 people arrested for the Averills' murder were released after all the witnesses suddenly died from bullet wounds, while the main witness, Jim Averill's nephew, died from arsenic poisoning just before the trial. A few days later, enraged farmers captured one of the 6 culprits and stabbed him with pitchforks. After that, the mercenaries killed a few more people. All of this eventually led to a conflict that lasted several years and ended in a bloody massacre. Then there was another trial where all the American senators who had sided with the cattle barons were found not guilty, while the surviving mercenaries were released because the state had no money to keep them in prison. Overall, this story was perfect for a big film about class warfare. For Michael Cimino, it was a dream project. Since his Oscar win allowed him to dictate terms, he secured a fantastic contract with the studio. It stated that Cimino couldn't be fined for exceeding the budget as long as he met the shooting deadlines set by the studio. Naturally, studio executives, assuming it would only cost a couple extra $1 million, turned a blind eye to this clause. The budget waste during filming was outrageous. For example, one day Cimino decided that the distance between buildings on either side of a street wasn't large enough. As a result, the entire street had to be rebuilt. The producer suggested saving money by only moving buildings on one side, but Cimino refused. According to him, the issue was with the lighting. Moving just one side would create the wrong shadows at certain times of day. This decision alone cost the studio $1.5 million. Another example of irrational spending was Cimino's decision to build an irrigation system under the battlefield. He wanted the grass to be a vivid green to contrast with the bright red after the battle. Installing the irrigation system cost the studio another $3 million. As production wrapped up, a scandal broke out between the studio and Cimino. The studio, having poured enormous sums into the project, started questioning where exactly the money was going. Their biggest concern was the outrageously high cost of renting the land where filming was taking place. When they looked into it, they discovered that the land in question was owned by none other than Michael Cimino himself. Almost all the actors in the film received their highest fees at the time. Since many were quite famous, the total cost of the cast exceeded $10 million. Chris Christopherson, Christopher Walken, John Hurt, Sam Waterston, Isabel Huppert, Jeff Bridges, and Tom Noonan all set new personal pay records. By the time filming wrapped, the budget for Heaven's Gate had ballooned to $40 million. But that wasn't the end. The first version of the film, edited by Cimino, was nearly 5 hours long. Rumor has it the final battle scene could have been released as a separate film, as it lasted over an hour and a half. The stunned studio executives demanded that Cimino shorten the runtime. After much arguing, Cimino locked himself in the editing room and hired armed guards to keep the studio from interfering. He eventually cut the film down to 3.5 hours, and this version premiered in New York. The premiere itself was a disaster, which came as a big surprise to Michael Cimino. According to eyewitnesses, the director looked completely confused at the event and couldn't understand what people disliked about his film. Immediately after the disastrous premiere, Cimino contacted the studio and demanded more time to re-edit the film. The studio agreed, and he created a new version that ran 3 hours. Interestingly, the only country where Heaven's Gate was a success was France. The film received positive reactions from both audiences and critics. Moreover, the 3.5-hour version was the one released there. The final budget for the Western reached an astronomical $44 million, making it one of the most expensive films in cinema history at the time of its release. Adjusted for inflation, Heaven's Gate remained the most expensive Western in Hollywood history. Even modern big-budget Westerns, such as Django Unchained, which cost $100 million, seem to belong to a different price category. Today, Heaven's Gate would have cost around $170 million. The only films that can compete with it are sci-fi and fantasy westerns like Wild Wild West, The Lone Ranger, and Cowboys and Aliens. To put that $44 million into perspective, let's compare it to the budgets of other films released around the same time. The first Indiana Jones film, Raiders of the Lost Ark, released in 1981, cost $18 million. The Empire Strikes Back had the same $18 million budget. Francis Ford Coppola's Apocalypse Now, released in 1979, cost $31 million, and yet Coppola later complained that he had too much money, with the crew spending more time having fun than actually making the film. Flash Gordon, which flopped at the box office in 1980, the same year as Heaven's Gate, had a $35 million budget. That's especially notable given that it was produced by Dino De Laurentiis, whose projects were notorious for their excessive spending. In American theaters, Heaven's Gate grossed a mere $3 million. United Artists, already struggling, found itself on the verge of bankruptcy. Even the latest Bond film, released in 1981, couldn't save it. Although For Your Eyes Only grossed over $100 million worldwide, its performance seemed disappointing compared to Moonraker, who had made over $200 million in 1979. Afterward, the Transamerica Corporation, which owned United Artists, decided to sell the studio. The buyer was Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, marking the end of United Artists' 62-year existence as an independent studio. Following the film's release, many actors who worked on Heaven's Gate harshly criticized Cimino. Tom Noonan claimed that the director tormented the cast and crew and even personally threatened him with a weapon. However, some defended Cimino. Chris Christopherson said he was proud of the film, while Jeff Bridges stated that he had watched it multiple times and liked it more with each viewing. Heaven's Gate also dealt with serious blow to the Western genre. Until the mid-80s, major studios largely avoided it. The failures of the first Westerns released after 1985 were often blamed on Heaven's Gate. Exactly 10 years later, Kevin Costner restored faith in the genre with Dances with Wolves. While working on it, most people predicted it would flop. However, with a $22 million budget, the film grossed $424 million. After that, studios flooded theaters with westerns. For Michael Cimino, Heaven's Gate marked the downfall of his career. In 1979, he was Hollywood's most promising director, predicted to have a brilliant future. But after Heaven's Gate, Cimino suddenly became an outcast. 5 years later, he returned with Year of the Dragon. Since he had a multi-film contract with United Artists, MGM, which inherited the contract, decided to give him another chance. However, the Mickey Rourke-led film flopped at the box office and even earned Cimino a Golden Raspberry nomination. His last major project was the independent film The Sun Chaser, released in 1996. It was nominated for the Golden Palm at Cannes Film Festival, but never received a wide release. Many analysts believe the studio could have avoided Heaven's Gate's disastrous failure. They argue that its abysmal box office performance was largely due to the complete lack of a marketing campaign. In 1980, audiences simply weren't aware of the film. The studio only became concerned about Heaven's Gate when the budget had already surpassed $30 million. By then, they were busy with For Your Eyes Only, which had its own massive $30 million budget. When the time came to promote Heaven's Gate, the studio had no money left. After its premiere, even the little funding United Artists could have allocated for advertising was instead funneled into the new Bond movie. The studio saw Heaven's Gate as a lost cause and threw all its efforts into Bond instead. Of course, the studio executives likely never expected Heaven's Gate to gross just $3 million at the box office. Thanks for watching. Subscribe and stay tuned.